Good morning, everyone. Those of you who are out here so early. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce this year's keynote speaker. He is particularly appropriate for our theme, the resilient city, the new urban paradigm. Gord Miller is the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. For the past 14 years, he has served as the province's independent watchdog for the environment, producing annual reports on Ontario's compliance with the Environmental Bill of Rights and progress reports on the greenhouse gas reductions and energy conservation. Gord's perspective is both local and global, and today he is going to share his views on the resilience of our urban environment in response to human-induced climate change. He will discuss the very real implications for public safety, the environment, and economics if the Ontario government fails to act on the new normal of extreme weather. Despite the overwhelming evidence and environmental challenges we face, he remains optimistic that we, as humans, have the capacity to mobilize and change the course we're currently on. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Gord Miller, Environmental Commissioner of Ontario.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Larry, because you very nicely introduced the concept. When I came up, I thought, well, we're talking about a resilient city and a new urban paradigm to address that. And I was going to make initially the link to that the major stressor, that although in terms of urban resilience there are many aspects and many facets of that kind of issue, but there was one dominant stressor that is occurring in our society today, as Larry has explained, and that is the implications of climate change. It's the dominant vector which shapes the challenge for the future and is the major issue of resiliency. It resonates within all sorts of aspects of our societies and our economy. So that is the big story. It is the frame. But I noticed in the program there are a number of speakers who are going to come follow me who are going to talk about the details of climate change. I don't have slides, I have no graphs, but they will make the case. I don't have to, but I can just tell you that I work extensively in this area and have for many years. And I'm charged by statute, by law, to report to the Ontario Legislature each year on the success of the Ontario government and Ontario in reducing its greenhouse gases and meeting its future targets in greenhouse gases. And I release that in a report, which you can. I brought 4 or 5, and they're at the back somewhere. But you can get it on the internet if you want to know how Ontario is doing. So, within that context, though, I'm not going to go into the details of climate change and what it is and the greenhouse gases and their reduction. I'm going to talk only peripherally about that, because what it comes down to, and I think it's the major message that you have to have in leading off on today's meeting before you frame your ideas later, is that there are, in fact, 4 big ideas related to the climate change situation, related to resilience. And it's those 4 big ideas that I want to impress you with to start the day, because that is what you have to keep in mind. So what's the first idea? Well, the first idea has to do with the science relating to climate change. Now, I first issued my first report in 2002. My gosh, 12 years ago, I issued a report called "Is the Science Sound?" with a question mark, with respect to climate change to the Legislature of Ontario. And I, of course, concluded 12 years ago that the science was sound. Well, fair enough. It was, nothing was done, no response, because people just stalled and went on and were disinterested. However, time has gone. The scientists have been working on this issue for now going on over 50 years, and the IPCC reports, which are just coming out, the last one will be out, I guess it's just out now, but it came out through 2014, has unequivocally established at a very, very high level of confidence that there is an absolute connection, that greenhouse gases and deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels and deforestation are causing accumulation of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. It is anthropogenic in its origins, and it is changing the climate. But what you have to understand, when I said in 2002, I was using in that report the future tense. As a lot of the climate change discussion has been up to now, the future tense, this will cause, or we will see this. Well, the first big idea is if you are still caught up in the future tense, forget it. It is, as Larry said, we've seen it here in Toronto in recent extreme weather. The extreme weather events are here. They are now. The climate is not changing. It is changed. And the science shows that, okay? If you look at the so-called polar vortex winter and summer we had here, these are phenomena of global climate change that is real and present. If you look at, and it's hard to believe in Toronto given the winter and summer we've had, but nonetheless, if you look at the data on the Northern Hemisphere on extreme temperatures, it follows a normal distribution if you look over a long period of time. And we if you remember your stats, you can have the standard deviation is sigma, and if you look in a distribution, you can have a 3 sigma event, which if you recall your stats, are things that fall away from the mean and only have a frequency of about 1/3 of 1%. Well, those 3 sigma events in heat that we had that established through the 20th century now are occurring 14% of the time in the Northern Hemisphere. The climate has changed. It is real. And it's day to day, and it is no longer something we will face or our grandchildren will face or our children will face. We are facing it now. That is the first big idea. It is a huge challenge because the time that we thought we had to respond has evaporated in the years, the decades we've been talking about this and doing nothing. So now the challenge has changed. And not only has it changed, it's getting worse. It continues to change. And that is the climate change we have now, and what we're experiencing is not because of the emissions last year. It's because of the emissions over previous decades, and there's a delay in the response time of the global system. So it will continue to change because even now we are still emitting. We emitted more greenhouse gases last year than ever before. So that's the first big. Second big idea that you have to keep in mind has to do with insurance. Now, you may not have expected that word in that context because you've got the science change guy up there, but our economy and our societies, we can't function without insurance. And I always use the example, I prefer to use the example of our house for those of us that have homes, and we have to pay an insurance company primarily because of fire insurance, right? And the homes are built of safe materials designed in a way that will not catch fire. Electrical code is applied. We pay our taxes to support fire departments, and we design our roads so that fire trucks can get up the roads quickly in response time in the minutes and that sort of thing. Yet all those protections, at least in the newer parts of our construction and our society, are all put in place to make sure that fires won't destroy our homes. And yet we still need insurance to cover off that final risk, that little bit of risk we have. We willingly pay the insurance company lots of money every year to cover off that risk of which we are a total failure. And of course, we might do that out of the goodness of our hearts, but primarily we do it because our mortgage companies insist we do it. You cannot get a mortgage if you don't have fire insurance. Then that's how the financial system works. All the risk has to be covered, and that slim risk at the end is covered off by insurance. It's how we secure our economy. Well, of course, the big change is that the Insurance Bureau of Canada now reports that fire is no longer the leading cause of property insurance claims in Canada. Water damage and wind damage due to extreme weather events is now the major cause of property insurance claims. And the insurance companies have been telling us for more than a decade, this is a real problem. We cannot go on, this little bit of risk that we were insuring for a few $100 on your home is now this much risk, and we're not insuring it for a few $100 anymore. We may not insure it at all because the risk has grown too large. And there are portions of this city that I am told are no longer insurable. That is the real tangible, because if you're not insurable, you can't get a mortgage, you can't sell your home, it's a total loss. This is profound change that is with us now because our society cannot exist without that insurance covering off the bit of risk. And in terms of the risk to our cities and infrastructure, I've asked, this is in all of your bags, your delegate bags. It's an excerpt from one of my reports, my last talking about it's called Sink, Swim, or Tread Water, Adapting Infrastructure to Extreme Weather Events. So you might want to have a look at that in terms of sort of developing that idea somewhat. So those are two of the big ideas facing us. The science says it's real, it's here, it's now, and the insurance companies say, look, we cannot tolerate these risks anymore. What's the third? The third is something called unburnable carbon. And I don't know how well this has penetrated. It was a relatively new idea. It was captured and broadcast publicly first in 2011 and picked up in 2012 by Bill McKibben in Rolling Stone magazine, of all things. But it is it now penetrated the greater financial community in terms of awareness. But I'm going to go through what unburnable carbon is for you because you'll see the consequences. Basically, to understand what we're talking about, you have to go back to 2009 in Copenhagen when the nations of the world, including Canada, sat down to talk about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And at Copenhagen, it was agreed by all the nations of the world, and they signed off and they said, we agree to stop the emissions of greenhouse gases at a level that will not allow the world to exceed 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature and average temperature of the globe at equilibrium. Now, we're already in the last IPCC, we're at about 0.8 degrees Celsius, just to give you a perspective. But they said we're not going to allow it to increase more than 2 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. That's the amount of climate change that the world has agreed will allow. Now, I have to caution, that's not the amount of climate change that the scientists say is safe. It's not safe. The scientists are saying 1 degree would be a lot safer and a lot less disruption, but if you go to 2, we can probably tolerate that amount of disruption, and that will be somewhat acceptable level of disturbance, but it will profoundly change our societies and our economies. But nonetheless, the global nations agreed no more than 2 degrees Celsius. Won't let the Earth warm more than that. Well, what does that mean? Well, then it means a leap to physics, because the amount of the temperature of the Earth is just a function of the physics. The amount of greenhouse gases, the physicists have this very, very well understood. And if you pick a number like that, 2 degrees, then with some uncertainty around it, you now have a budget. You have a budget of how much carbon dioxide or its equivalent you can put in the atmosphere, and that's the budget you have. And you can't exceed it. And carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for over a century, so you have a fixed budget. Well, and these numbers will be meaningless to you, but nonetheless, they calculated, well, what is that budget from pre-industrial levels to keeping under 2 degrees? Well, it's about a number like 2,900 gigatons of CO2 equivalents in the atmosphere. Okay, so we have a hard number, a budget. Well, how much have we already put in? Well, we've already put in 1,900 gigatons. Okay, do the subtraction. About 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent is what we've got left to spend. That's how much. Okay, well, that's a lot, so that sounds good. What does that mean? Well, here's the rub. What these people these economists in Britain did, they said, well, let's look at the statements, the financial statements of all the oil companies and all the coal companies and all the gas companies, and then we'll get what we can from the national oil companies and things, and we'll look at how much is actually stated on these financial statements as being in reserve. How much oil, how much coal, how much gas. And of course, that's going to be burnt, so we'll convert that, on paper from barrels of oil or tons of coal into how much carbon dioxide that means into the atmosphere. And remember, our budget is only 1,000 gigatons. That's the maximum we can put into the atmosphere. When they looked at the world's reported reserves of coal, oil, and gas, converted it to CO2, they found out that there was about 3,000 gigatons worth of CO2 in the stated reserves, and they're still spending billions of dollars looking for more. We know we can't put 3,000 gigatons into the atmosphere without destroying the planet. Yet that's what our business model says what we're going to do. There is, therefore, about, and there are different estimates of this, by the way, I'm using the ones from the International Energy Agency, because there are worse estimates, but about 66% of all the oil, gas, and natural gas that we have identified and is on the reserves cannot be burnt. We don't know whose oil can't be burnt. We don't know whose coal can't be burnt, but we know it can't be burnt. And all the nations of the world agree. But there is a huge amount of unburnable carbon out there. And since you're talking about urban resilience, you have to think about that, because the biggest producers of greenhouse gases in many areas, certainly in Ontario, are transportation fuels, and our city is run on gasoline and diesel, and heating of our buildings, which in Ontario is largely natural gas. So whatever happens, and it is too early to say what is going to happen, it will be profoundly changed, because we have to keep within that budget of 1,000 gigatons, or the consequences are extremely severe. So unburnable carbon is a big idea that shapes what you come up with for solutions and resiliency. And the last of the four big ideas is a little more abstract, but indulge me here. Those of us who have been around for a while remember the Kyoto Protocol and all the discussion leading up to it in the mid-90s. And at that time, the terms that came up in discussion that floated around were climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. They were embedded into the Kyoto Protocol. And at that time, the concept there was mitigation was reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. Like, we have to make a deal. And much of the Kyoto Protocol that we talked about was, what are the targets and how can we reduce the emissions? How can we mitigate the impact of greenhouse gases? All the time, and there was discussion about adaptation. Well, we have to adapt because the climate's changing and going to change, and so we have to have a discussion of how we'll adapt and change our ways, change the structure, the infrastructure, the nature of our buildings, the nature of our economy. And so adaptation was always sort of there. And then we went on and we began to obsess on mitigation. And of course, not only we obsess, Canada committed to, the Parliament of Canada agreed to ratify the Kyoto Protocol targets, and then of course we reneged internationally entirely, and now we find ourselves decades later completely without any kind of plan. Well, I guess we have a plan, it's not being followed, but we have a situation where we've done nothing on the mitigation side. But there are consequences to delay. Things are changing. And now we have a situation, as I said, it is real. It is happening. It's happening to Toronto, that the extreme weather events are causing impacts. So we do have to adapt. We know we have to adapt. You're going to be talking about that today. You're going to be talking about, I'm sure, intensity, duration, and frequency curves, and the hydrologic changes and how that changes everything, how the built environment. There's no question we have to adapt. And adaptation, so I guess it has its name, but the term mitigation has changed. That's the big idea. Mitigation is no longer a discussion of how we can reduce greenhouse gases to avoid future consequences like it was in the early 90s. That is not the discussion anymore. The future consequences are already here, and they will continue to impress us. And there is an acceleration of climate change that is going on. So it is not about mitigating and stopping the effect and getting to some nice, warm, cozy situation that we can tolerate. That option is off the table. We are going to be challenged with increasingly severe weather challenges and other climate-related challenges, and the term mitigation applies in this way. We have to come to some agreement on mitigation. We have to reduce greenhouse gases because you cannot adapt to an accelerating rate of change. You can't adapt. If you come out and you say, well, we know how to build bridges and culverts and handle the water now, only to find out 3 years from now that the rainfall is even that more severe and the storms are that more intense. The only way we can succeed in adapting and creating resilient cities is to somehow slow down and bring the rate of change down to something tolerable, a level that we can adapt to. So the word mitigation in context of climate change is no longer about coming to some warm and fuzzy conclusion. It is now about slowing down the pace so that we can adapt and we can possibly adapt to the change that is thrust upon us. So those are the 4 big ideas. I hope they sink in. As you can see, I think that they frame events coming in the coming years. They constrain the options, but on the other hand, as Bridget says, I'm not pessimistic as much. I have to tell you this story because just to close, because we're talking. I was at another event last night, climate change event, another speaker, and we were talking afterwards, and somebody was saying when I was making some of these points, they said, "Well, Gord, you're so pessimistic." I said, "No, I'm not pessimistic. And one of the chap at the table spoke up and so captured it. I told him I was going to steal this. He says, I'm a licensed ship captain. He has a licensed ship captain. He says, I understand what Gord's talking about. He says, as a licensed ship captain, the first thing they drill into your head is that before you have a plan, you have to accept that the ship is sinking. I thought, that's exactly right. Then he says, getting people putting life jackets on and getting to the lifeboats, all that flows. You'll get a response from people. Once they believe the ship is sinking, you can get a response. And I thought, wow, that's the point, right? We're in a society, we're on the Titanic here, and the reason that I'm so dark, and the reason I'm putting so much emphasis is people, the ship is sinking. It's time to put the life jackets on, get to the muster stations, and then maybe we can save ourselves. But that's the message for you today. Good luck on your deliberations.
Excuse the water around your ankles. Thank you, Gord, for both your passion and your tenacity and your responsibilities, and for keeping the environment front of mind with our provincial politicians. Gord's latest government report can be found on the memory sticks. They're either in your delegate bags, and if they're not, then they're on a table out in the display area out front.